Before we get started, we'd like to thank our sponsors for making this event possible. Special thanks to our platinum sponsor, OLAS. OLAS enables everyone to own a share of AI, specifically autonomous agent economies. We're also excited to highlight our silver sponsors: NIA, empowering decentralized applications and blockchain ecosystems; Venice AI, a private and uncensored alternative to popular AI apps; Mira, unified AI infrastructure, secured by crypto; and Theric, the first on-chain multi-agent system. To learn more about all of our sponsors, check the description below and dive in. Enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone. I'm Can. Welcome to our panel for Delphi's AI and crypto panel. Today with me, I have very smart guests. We're going to discuss payments for AI agents, which is one of my favorite topics in the crypto AI stack. Yeah, why don't we start with a brief round of introductions? Yuga, maybe we could start with you.
Sure thing. It's great to be here. So my name is Yuga Cohler. I go by yuga.eth in the on-chain world. I'm a senior engineering manager at Coinbase. I work in the Coinbase developer platform, leading some of our on-chain AI efforts. And our goal within CDP is to bring the next million developers on-chain so that they can in turn bring the next billion users on-chain.
Awesome. Don, you want to go next?
Sure, can do. First off, thanks for having me. Great panel, great topic, close to my heart. I'm Don Gossen. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Nevermind. As cliched as this is going to sound, it's a bit of a labor of love. I've been in the ML and data space for pretty much my entire career, so the last 20 plus years. Started in commodities trading on the risk side, doing what back then was called statistical modeling. And then parlayed that into a career for the better part of a decade and a half in IT consulting as a subject matter expert in data and analytics. Took me all over the world building large-scale data estates for ML purposes for some of the biggest companies on the planet: HSBC, L'Oreal, AXA, Sharp, etc. So that sort of refined my sensibilities around the broader topics on AI. And then in 2016, caught the crypto bug, went down the rabbit hole, saw the simplicity and elegance of applying blockchain technology to the type of work that I was doing, and ended up co-founding a project called Ocean Protocol, which was one of the first forays, I guess, of bringing these two technologies together. And yeah, have just kept at it for almost a decade now and have distilled it into Nevermind, which is really a hyper focus on AI payments. So this panel is very topical for us. We have a very particular view of the world. What we believe is that we're witnessing the rise of a new consumer that's going to manifest as trillions of AI agents, and that these agents are going to change commerce forever. I think this is a category-defining scenario, AI commerce being the new category. And we're positioning ourselves as the PayPal of AI and the engine behind AI commerce.
Hey, everybody. My name is Craig DeWitt. I'm the co-founder of Skyfire. Skyfire is building an open visa for AI agents. Agents use Skyfire today to pay other agents, to pay for data, and to pay for services on an on-demand basis. In terms of my background, about 10 years in payments at Bloomberg and also at Ripple, starting RippleNet in 2014, 2015. Super excited to talk to this panel today because I think we're all believers in the fundamental change that's happening right now, and that is AI agents being the largest consumers of block space as well as the largest drivers of commerce in the near future.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So as a starter, I want to very fundamentally ask you guys, what do you see as the problem here? Like, what is the problem that we are solving here? So basically, why could you articulate why you think existing payment solutions that have been working for humans for ages is just not suitable for agents? Like why? Like a simpler way to ask this is, why can't I just give my AI agent, say, my credit card information and then have it purchase things on my behalf. What is so different with the nature of agents that you think we need a new payment solution? Maybe this time we could start with Craig and then go to Don, and then you go next.
So cards seem like a pretty simple solution, but there are some major limitations when it comes to actually giving agents your card and letting them use it. And I think it comes down to just access and authorization, the actual input of card details into a checkout solution, the rail economics, then like actually receiving funds as well. So just going through those, it's not trivial to give an agent your credit card details. And so you have this thing called PCI compliance, which is serious. It's super easy to get kicked off those rails by your card processor. And also there's no fundamental guardrails that exist, like if an agent just has access to your card material. Like if you can figure that out, good luck. If you can't figure that out though, the input is not simple. So we have spent a very long time optimizing the checkout flow for humans and eyeballs. And cards are designed for human input. There's not actually a programmatic API that you can use to enter your card details today. Companies are trying to. They're doing screen scraping, counting pixels, trying to plug in numbers, but like the error rate is atrocious there, and they're just praying that they don't get challenged with the CVC code. And then if you can figure all that out, the rail economics do not work. And so, if you dive into like how cards work, they're incredibly sophisticated, right? You have a merchant bank acquirer, you have a card issuer, you have the card network. In some cases, you have the ultimate settlement happening via SWIFT between the banks. It's amazing they've got it as cheap as they have, and that's still going to be 3% plus 35 fixed cents for every time you swipe a card. That already kills a ton of use cases that agents need when they're paying on demand for services. And then finally, if you can do all that, actually receiving the funds as an agent builder and originating yourselves is not simple, right? From what we see at Skyfire, about 70% of these developers are not inside the United States. And so my bet is like you have this teenager in, I don't know, Malaysia who's going to build the next big hit app or agent that needs to receive payment. Like, good luck getting a bank account that you can then hook up to actually receive those funds. And so those are all structural issues that are going to take years to align constituents to fix. And you have a much simpler solution, and that is blockchain, which are ultimately designed for payments, and I think have finally found their use case. Might not be humans, it'll be these AI agents.
Don, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think I'd echo all the same sentiments as Craig. I think there is, there's the regulatory element of this. How can you justify, the handing over of that critical information, and more importantly, when something does go awry, how do you demonstrate potentially that either it went awry during the activity that the agent was performing, or it was the agent that performed erroneously, what have you, right? So there are those structural issues. The reality is we can do it right now. I think the simpler, instead of a credit card, it would be likely through open banking software in Europe and possibly like ACH type payments in the US, where you would provide the agent with your login information to those systems and give access to your bank account. I think my issue with the question is more fundamental in nature. I think we're doing ourselves a disservice in anthropomorphizing agents. I think that's the simplest way to look at them. Oh, these are going to be our assistants or our servants, and I'm going to imbue them with these characteristics and give them money, and they're going to perform activities for us. And in the short term to midterm, these are probably the types of use cases that emerge and are the most prolific. What interests us the most is actually when we get beyond that scenario, and we're looking at purely agentic transactions taking place between AI agents. I think there's also, there's two limitations. Craig addressed the experiential side of things, as well as some of the technical limitations. But if we drill into the technical side of things, there's a question of like, what is the cost of the thing that is being requested. For instance, the GPU cycles that are going to provide the inference. And at the moment, those services, at least in, sort of a pay to play scenario, those are fractions of a cent, right? So we're just right off the bat, we have this limitation. Well, how do you transact on something that can't be accounted for within the existing payment system, right? The answer to that is you probably go some aggregation route. Maybe that manifests as like a subscription service, or a billing usage-based pricing model. There are limitations in all of these. There are pluses and minuses in these setups. To Craig's point, there is a system, a very elegant one already in place that will enable us to get to the level of granularity that we want for invoking the types of services that we're talking about, whether that's different models for inference being invoked or different vector databases with context information that's relevant to a specific use case, or different orchestrators for that matter. And trying to cobble these together with existing payment rails is just not friction free. It's complicated. It's non-trivial. So, this is one of the many reasons for doing what we're doing.
All right. Yeah, transitioning over to Yuga, and then I'll summarize your points.
Totally. It's great to be on this panel because you learn so much from the founders who are working in the space. Craig, I didn't know about like the lack of sort of credit card, API-based credit card submission mechanisms, which makes sense given the stringency of PCI compliance. I thought of a couple other reasons in addition to everything that Don and Craig said in terms of why crypto makes sense, why on-chain makes sense for AI agents. I think there at the simplest level, you could argue debit card, credit card could work based on human input, and the AI agent carries that forward to make its payments. But that definitely has its own limitations. The first is as agent orchestration becomes a larger part of the ecosystem, so it's not just a single agent, but you're really working with a number of different agents, coordinating different tasks that roll up to a more complex objective, you're going to want fund segregation across agents. And so that means you're going to want separate accounts, separate sources of funding for each agent, which means if you have N agents, theoretically you would want N credit cards, and that's just not a scalable solution. So crypto wallets, which can be spun up very easily, are a very natural way of addressing that problem. So it's the multi-agent problem. The second is a very attractive aspect of on-chain transactions, particularly on the fast L2 networks and the L1 networks that we've seen come online over the past year or so, is instantaneous settlement. So any sort of fiat rail is going to take multiple hours at the very least, if not several days, because fundamentally you're altering ledgers that are not universal. You're updating one ledger that belongs to one bank or a credit card company or what have you, and then it takes several days for that to be settled, and then the other ledger across the wire that belongs to the other bank has to be updated. Versus the blockchain is universal state, and so the ledger updates happen in real time, and this is instantaneous. For agent-to-agent use cases especially, this is going to be important because the request response is going to happen instantaneously, sub 1,000 milliseconds. And so you want that atomicity, that instantaneousness of as soon as you get what you want from the agent, you want the transaction to settle at the exact same time. And related to that is the lack of chargebacks. I've heard, having worked in crypto for a while, a lot of merchants have problems with, just in commerce, have problems with chargebacks where a customer will pay money, the merchant will deliver the service, and then in certain cases, bad actors will ask for a refund in bad faith, even though the service was rendered. And depending on the system, these dispute resolutions are very difficult and often favor the consumer for good reason, because the consumer is generally the smaller player. But for businesses, this is tough, especially when they're doing their job as expected. So crypto is attractive in that you have instantaneous settlement and a lack of chargebacks. And then the last thing I'll say is that as the intelligence of these agents grows exponentially, as we can expect them to, just as we've seen the foundational LLM models increase in intelligence, we can expect the expressiveness and the complexity of these transaction types to increase over the course of time. So a very simple payments pattern, again, is, agent A pays agent B, let's say, and agent B provides some service to agent A. But over time, that's probably going to be the simplest baseline. And then you're going to want other types of mechanisms like escrow, and maybe there's some yield bearing component, and then maybe there's a multi-party agentic payout and so forth. And all of that is natively possible on the blockchain because it's Turing complete. You can represent any type of payment pattern that you want, versus with fiat, I suppose it's theoretically possible, but the orchestration of it is just going to be an absolute nightmare because you're cobbling together a bunch of different fiat rails in order to come up with this more complex pattern. So for all those reasons, if you want to get to a point where agents are able to, on their own, provide these expressive transactions, I think the blockchain is a perfect place to do that. And that's why I'm super bullish on agents using on-chain as the rails for these payments.
And just to add to that, our kind of end state vision is this soup of trillions of agents transacting with one another, but in a peer-to-peer bartering fashion, right? And then, strapping on all of this different functionality, Yuga, that you just brought up, right? How do you enable that with any sort of efficacy, trying to cobble together the existing payment solutions, which from a lot of this stuff was adopted begrudgingly, right? It was transitioned from a legacy state of mainframe services and brought online, which wasn't, I don't think that was ever really the intent. That's just the state that we found ourselves in. So having worked in banks and understanding the underlying implications of that legacy technology and understanding the scale and magnitude of these transactions that are coming down the pipe, hot and heavy, these systems are going to start to fail, right? And we need to replace them. It just so happens that we've spent the last 16 years or so, I think, refining this quite elegant solution to replace the existing payment systems. I do also want to add one more thing. I think the question runs counter to human endeavor, Like, personally, I really like the challenge of trying to replace the existing state with something new, right? And I think that's kind of, I don't know, Craig and you, that's big part of the reason why I'm here and get up in the morning, just because, like, I know there's an alternative system. I can see these agents coming. I want to provide the infrastructure that's going to enable scalability into the trillions of commercial actors.
Don, 100% agree with you. And I will say what's great about these technologies is you're right, they're old. They predate mainframes. Like some of the first financial tech was the super innovative company called Western Union that figured out they could use the telegram to instruct a bank. And I don't know how they did OPSEC, but it was dee. And that's why we call it a wire payment, because they used to be sent over copper wires. And the core tech, that SWIFT settlement system, hasn't really changed that much. And so I agree with you. There's a new system, there's a better system, but it's incredibly difficult to displace the monopolies that exist within payments today until you have these fundamental shifts. And we're seeing that fundamental shift right now. And so if you're going to make that change, the opportunity that's being presented with AI and a new consumer base is right now. So Don, I think it's kind of now or never if we make this work.
Agreed.
All right. So lots of great points. I took some notes. So so you guys mentioned ability to do micropayments, ability for payments to be instantly settled without chargebacks. Craig, you mentioned that like agents, basically it's more applicable for on-demand payments as opposed to something that's like decided a priori. Don, you mentioned like metering complexity of all the complexity behind these inference and what goes behind the scenes. And then Yuga mentioned like there's going to be many agents, multiple agents. Almost these going to spin up like ephemeral entities. They're going to be nested, so you're going to need all of them to have wallets. Whereas like as a human, you only have one credit card, so it's like it's going to be a mess if you associate with this with like all these agents. There's scalability argument. There's and then global. All right, like crypto is by nature is pretty global. So I'm buying all of these arguments. I think they're very strong arguments. One pushback I have is on the regulatory side. So I want to challenge you guys on this a bit, and that is, like, there's an overheard argument in crypto is that basically AI agents can't have bank accounts, but they can have crypto wallets. When you peel the onion and go one level down, trying to understand what this means, like immediately what comes to my mind is that AI agents basically can transfer value without having to go through KYC verification. It is very true. Like today, if you have a self-custody wallet, you're the customer of yourself, so you don't have to go through like KYC to transfer value with crypto. But we still need to make sure that AI agents are what they claim that they are, right? Like if I'm paying an AI agent to do a design for me, I need to know that it actually is going to like create a design, right? So we need a sort of identification or authentication layer to work in tandem with payments. We cannot just like ignore that. And what this means is like basically like if we're going to have like, I mean, one counter could be like verifiable inference, right? Like if I could just like verify cryptographically my inference, I wouldn't need to like basically get my agent identified, or an agent, like in other words, an agent don't have to get identified through let's say central system. But we're not there yet. It's not practical. So I think like I'm not seeing the point of this argument is basically my point. So I'm curious what you all think here. So maybe we could this time do Yuga, Don, and then Craig.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I mean, I think it's important for all of us to recognize we're still very early. All of this is being figured out. I think if we just figure out the payments aspect of it, that's going to unlock billions of dollars, bring $1 billion on chain, and unleash a lot of productivity of these agents. At the same time, I absolutely agree that authentication and verifiability of the work that the agents are doing in response to these payments is going to be a critical aspect. My outlook on this is that it's going to be very similar to a lot of things in crypto. There's going to be centralized flavors of this and decentralized flavors of this, right? So you'll have centralized companies that attest on behalf of the agents that they provide access to via payments. And they will have large amounts of trust. They will garner large amounts of trust from their end users. And, there's just no reason to think that a company that makes its bread and butter from providing the access to the agents via on-chain payments is going to be fallacious about it. Now, of course, we work in crypto, so that may not be enough, but like I have no doubt that there are going to be companies where the trust that they get from their customers is going to be that authentication layer. And frankly, a lot of people are going to be satisfied by that. There's also going to be a decentralized flavor of this. And so you can imagine a world where you will have agentic registries on chain that provide information about, hey, what wallet belongs to what agent, what is the agent capable of, what is the protocol for accessing the agent. You can imagine a sort of standard, maybe similar to like ERC 721, where maybe there's a metadata file off chain where you can access that has all the RPC endpoints you need to hit to access the agent. You can also imagine there being a protocol that couples the accessing of the agent to a payment. Craig and I were talking before, there's this HTTP code 402, which is payment required, which was there in sort of the beginnings of the internet, but never really got implemented. Now may be the moment for that, where if you're able to atomically access an agent via an RPC or some other mechanism, and then at the same time make an on-chain payment, and the service provider is able to verify that the payment the payment was made, and B, the payment corresponds to the issuer of the request, that's a really exciting use case, I think, for verifying that the payment happened in return to a successful response that the agent provides. And then once you have sort of a registry and discoverability, You can imagine coupling that with, just as we have this notion of proof of humanity, right? Maybe you scan eyeballs to prove that you're human. You want proof of agency. You want proof that not only do you this entity passes the Turing test, but actually does better than a standard human on whatever the case may be. Maybe it's like the SATs or whatever specific task that the agent claims that they're able to do. So these building blocks, I think a lot of them are already here in nascent forms. They're going to take time to mature, and it's going to take time to bring them to scale and on chain, and etc. But conceptually, I don't think that these are impossible to overcome. In fact, I think what we are going to see as more of these agents come online and there's more demand for verifiability of the capabilities of the agent, that these specific modular units, whether it's the payment verification or proof of agency or what have you, are going to become use cases in and of themselves, and frankly, maybe even become companies in and of themselves. And that's going to be really exciting to see.
Very good points. Yep. Don?
All right. So I think that the real question here is at a protocol level, right? So we have existing protocol for KYC. To Yuga's point, there is this, function of proof of humanity when you go through an existing KYC process. Normally, you need to provide some kind of biometric information that usually comes in the form of like taking a photograph of your face, right? So very kind of simplistically and somewhat naively, I think that the commentary here around agents aren't going to have bank accounts, right? It's a bit tongue-in-cheek. What's being referenced is there's a modification to the protocol, right? Nobody's saying that verification of these agents isn't needed. I think it's the exact opposite. What coming out of the Web3 space, what we understand is that verification, attestation, and the reputational capacity that we need to build up in these agents actually comes from the provenance trail of that agent's history and how it's interacting with other agents, whether they're carbon-based agents or human-based agents within this, transactional system that's taking place. So I think, that it's a reflection on the augmentation to the payments protocol that's required in order to facilitate these agentic payments. To the point around just discreetly on verifiable inference, well, that's fine. You can have an inference that is the result set that's verifiable. It came from this model. But when you look at the construct and architecture of an agent, there's two sort of fundamental components that can be exclusive to one another. And an agent has reasoning and or tool selection capabilities, right? When we look at the tool selection capabilities, the question, John, becomes, what are we actually selecting, right? What is the agent indicating to the requester it's going to provide? And then providing attestation that those services have been provisioned either singularly, each service by service is attested to, or it's just the agent that attests to the end state result, right? And so the question becomes, how do we do that in an efficient manner? To Yuga's point, a lot of this is trial and error at this point. But the relevance and requirement for verifiability and attestation has not gone away. I think everybody on this panel will agree we're just using a technology that I think is going to help substantiate the reputational drivers for each of these agents with much finer fidelity overall.
Craig, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I think there's two requirements that were baked into the question. One is really a government compliance and regulatory question, and the second one is what the market is requiring from this new consumer group. On the regulatory side, like, you have to be very smart with how you build in this space, primarily because in a lot of cases it's not actually clear what the rules of the road are. And there are ways to build intelligently to where you can offer services where you don't have to ask permission to a government to transact in commerce, which I think is such a freeing concept. And and, not getting on my soapbox too much, but fundamentally, I think something what America was originally built on. And there are opportunities with this technology to get back to that and make that a global phenomenon that anybody can operate freely in this space, but follow local regulations. The second piece is a market piece. And this is what we're actually hearing from our customers. And there's really two aspects here. One, you have the agents that want to transact with a business to buy something on demand. And second, you have the businesses that want to know who is buying from them in many cases. With the way that the technology works, like the shift of compliance in terms of actually facilitating what is promised falls on to the business because there's not a central counterparty that can revoke those dollars. And so what Skyfire is introducing is this concept that we call Know Your Agent, or KYA. So you've heard about KYB, which is like onboarding a business, or you've heard about KYC. These are familiar terms. KYA is really the concept of having the information on the agent or the business that's transacting in the new space, and then making it available via an authentication protocol. And right now it's fairly simple because it's really one-to-one proxies with either an individual or a business that's selling in this new fashion. But if you can take that information and actually connect it to what Don was talking about of a history of activity and interactions, you have something that's incredibly powerful that doesn't even exist in the current rail system. And so what's awesome, especially if you build this on a blockchain-based system, is when you add in these new ideas like KYA, you add in a complete history of transaction behavior, you can get a much more granular idea of who you're transacting with than you can even do in traditional space.
I want to add something on the reg side. So we've recognized this limitation. Obviously, if there's an attempt to sync your credit card with an agent, or potentially even leverage, a stable coin purely for that payment mechanism in sort of a pay-to-play capacity, you're likely going to invoke some kind of regulatory oversight. With respect to, by definition, it's an open loop system. Right. So what we've done at Nevermind, recognizing this potential issue, in particular around KYC, KYB, or Know Your AI, is remove that limitation, creating a closed loop system. Happy to get into the details of this, but what we enable is the translation of the metered cost of the underlying service or the aggregate cost of that agent to run. Translating that into a system of credits that manifests as a system of unit accounting on chain. And that's actually what you're buying entry into, are those credits or tokens that are ultimately redeemable specifically for that agent and or its specific set of services. So it becomes in this paradigm, from a protocol standpoint, a closed loop system. The redemption is only capable with that specific agent or agents that use the same credits system. And so that's our take on how to manage the lack of sort of regulatory clarity that exists at the moment, going beyond the very naive take of, well, they're AIs, so what is there to regulate, right? That's the way that we're kind of working around this and addressing all of these concerns around verifiability and that sort of thing.
Right. So I'm hearing kind of two alternative approaches from both sides, right? In Nevermind, what you explain is that basically it's a closed loop system. Before you actually interact with these agents or purchase anything with them, you first buy a credits that is kind of usable within the Nevermind system, basically. Whereas in Skyfire, what I'm hearing is that like the interaction is directly with USDC. So it's it's like a meaningful difference for both ends, for both of you guys. But Craig, I want to understand the KYA part a bit better. I think that's basically a merchant that wants to make sure that whoever buys stuff from them is like he wants to know, like it's from a perspective of business, knowing the agent that they sell things to, right? And how does that actually work? And like what what's the requirement to go through KYA for an agent?
Yeah. So there's really two aspects to Skyfire, and one is we are huge believers in open systems where anybody can transact, and so that's one thing that we've committed to is Skyfire is opening up a payment protocol that anybody can use, whether or not Skyfire is in the loop. So you have this open layer where anybody has freedom to transact. The businesses that are live on Skyfire today, in most cases, want to know or have some control over who can access their APIs. And that's really where this KYA process comes in, where the agent is, or the creator of the agent is onboarded through your standard KYC process today, to where you actually know who the creator of that agent is and who's ultimately responsible for that. And that's merged with all the information that you actually have on that agent itself. This is today an off-chain process. But it's
Right.
very
So
similar to what you see in like traditional finance.
So if my agent goes and buys some drugs for me, I basically it gets traced down to me, right? With this one, I'm just joking, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, like we also have, at least on Skyfire today, we have control over who is onboarded from the receiving side. Currently, there are no like players in that space. The kind of players that we're talking about today are large institutions or large sellers of data or services, like many that you're aware of. And you onboard those folks in the same way that Visa onboards them today. And that's the other side of the equation I was talking about, where you have a KYB process to where the buyers know exactly who they're working on. And so it's kind of like just the concept of, you have this underlying idea of a digital cash that can be transacted through anywhere using a protocol. But on top of that, you have something that is more of an onboarded process where only parties who are onboarded are willing to interact with each other. But that's an indication and a decision made by the participants of that market.
Got it.
I think that's
Okay.
good clarification, right? Both our approach by default, like Skyfire's, Nevermind's is open by default, right? Existing payment systems are closed by default, right? You have to go through this onboarding process in order to enter that system, and then the services within that system are open to those actors. In our case, we want the system to be open by default. Any agent can join, carbon-based or silicon-based. And then it's up to the individual implementation to determine what are the mechanisms that are going to limit interactivity within that system. So that's a core protocol decision. This is what I was talking about before. We need a fundamental shift in the protocol and the paradigm for payments when we talk about AI agents.
This has been an interesting conversation, but for sake of time, I'm just switching to a new topic. So when we talk about payments for AI agents, I can think of really thousands of use cases. Basically, anything digital goods and service can be purchased right now, maybe in future with robotics, even physical things. Where do you see the biggest opportunity is? What are you putting your focus on? Anyone? Don, Craig?
You want me to go first this time?
Yeah.
All right. So we're taking this in sort of like the time continuum. So in the immediate future, short to midterm, I think we see two sort of prevailing avenues that are super interesting and promising. One is on, I think the less provocative, though it might be more provocative in terms of like global ramifications. I don't know, white collar job displacement or micro gigification, I think is a very interesting emergent application of agents. So an example I give here is, you've got the cognition Devons of the world. There's a number of different products that have emerged, 11x and some other products where you've got agents that are going to perform jobs for you, right? But if we take something like Cognition Devon, It's not a co-pilot; it's a developer. You give it a task. It provides the code base to execute based on the requirements for the given task, right? How's this going to initially manifest? Well, it's probably going to manifest in places like the IT services industry, right? Where these agents are going to be leveraged as a cost displacement tool initially, right? I'm an IT services organization. I provide testing and QA resources to company X. Well, instead of charging you $150K a year for said resource, I'll charge you $75K for this agent. The interesting part about this is the domain space that these, in particular, Devons are operating in, right? We're talking about the development side, the technology side of business. They're going to be working side by side with other engineers, developers, product managers, individuals that are, constantly trying to optimize for latency, right? So very quickly, they're going to recognize latency in this new QA or testing bot that's been embedded into the team. And so I think we will see the decomposition of these services and their latency into this sort of micro gigification function where Craig and I will be in a meeting and we'll decide, hey, we need a new test case. Instead of paying this agent $75,000 a year, we'll pay it $75 for the next hour's worth of work, right? And then what we're already seeing is the decomposition of tasks into more granular task-based instantiations where you can, I think Yuga alluded to this, but you can basically decompose any given task into a bunch of subtasks. So enabling this across a multitude of different agents that are optimized for any given task and then engaging sort of best of breed agents to perform those subtasks at any given point in time at the cost of, a microtransaction. I think that's one area where we see things heating up and quite promising, especially over the midterm. The place where we see some, where we're getting inbounds is in the application of multi-agent systems as they relate to kind of games, right? An example would be like Chirper AI. It's basically murder bots on chain, right? Or online. It's a complete, what's this universe is enabled is individuals, the four of us, we can enter the system. We can prompt tune the agent, give it its own characteristics, and then let it loose on this agent, and it starts to interact with other agents. If you know Truth Terminal and how it's engaging with its community via Twitter, it's kind of the same thing, except the consumers in this case, or the interactivity that's taking place in these games and these multi-agent systems are other agents. Then you have this voyeuristic element where we are consuming through an interface like a news feed or a chat forum, what's going on in these universes amongst these different agents. And where there has been a real realization of leveraging crypto and the systems that we're talking about right now is consumers of these universes recognizing that these agents should have the ability to reward one another in game, as well as those outside consuming this content that these agents are the content that they're creating, being able to reward those agents kind of Hunger Games style, where you can airdrop things into the universe. You can't do that with existing payments or reward systems. And so the question becomes, how do you do that? And the realization from these builders is that, well, crypto makes a lot of sense. So this is another area that we find incredibly promising, I think, in the very short term. I've been following Truth Terminal since it was launched it obviously captured like Mark Andreessen's attention when he, airdropped it $50,000 worth of BTC, right? But I think the on Twitter it's only got like 40 or 50,000 followers, but it's going to catch wildfire, and it's these types of scenarios where I think the capacity for us to reward as well as for these agents to transact with one another is just going to continue to blossom.
Thanks, Don. Craig, you have thoughts on what?
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what's live today and like where we're actually seeing some volume over Skyfire, and that is number one. Most surprising to us is agents paying for data on an on-demand basis, and so there's a ton of data out there in a bunch of different contexts. The majority of the world's data is actually behind paywalls of some sort. And in order to be competitive, you can't really compete on the efficacy of your model anymore. These things are becoming asymptotic in terms of like how good they are. And so we have agents today paying for access to data like it's a really cool company called Pricing Culture that has a bunch of different pricing feeds that it contextualizes in a report format, as well as giving like instantaneous stuff on like secondhand luxury prices for Prada bags and stuff like that. That's being paid for today on a on-demand use using Skyfire. So like instead of these big old school enterprise data dumps of pricing, like you're starting to see more intelligent ways of accessing data, and that's available on Skyfire today. So you have agents paying for that. You also have agents paying for LLM access on demand, especially as these things expand. So you can pay for Open Router today. We see a lot of hitting various models, like 180 models on that. You can pay via Skyfire. Eric Voorhees' company, Venice AI, very cool what they're doing in terms of like this decentralized, censorship-resistant, open models. So that's being used today by agents to actually get access to these models without having to have subscriptions at a bunch of these downstream providers. And then a whole host of services. So some of the services that are being used today are web scraping services that can go out and pull everything from social media accounts to actually going and converting websites into machine readable stuff. Like there's a couple new services like agent-to-agent payments. A company called Micro One is live on Skyfire where you can pay an agent to do technical screening. And we're seeing some volume there in terms of agents like paying for those. I think what Don was saying earlier about like these white collar jobs or like what we call personas are really starting to take off, where you're starting to have like these manager agents that are subcontracting out jobs to these smaller pieces like technical screening or competitive analysis. And so we have a couple large, say like orchestration services that are going live with Skyfire that are allowing agents to pay other agents on an on-demand basis for subtasks. Like this is all cool. That's going to continue to expand that we're seeing. I'll tell you where I hope it goes, where I see it going is that I think people have conceptualized that agents and AI is going to fundamentally change the way that we interact with the internet. And I think going to a website is going to go the same way as the rotary phone. We'll be telling our kids like, yeah, I used to type in a URL and it like reconciled via this thing called DNS to an IP address. And like, it's going to fundamentally change. And it's going to be like, you're going to have a single app and that is going to programmatically generate what you need by going out online and getting that information. And the problem is like people haven't, I don't think, internalized the fact that that's fundamentally going to change the way that you buy stuff. And that's like e-commerce, right? There needs to be an open way to where you can programmatically hit an API, or your agent can programmatically hit an API and buy stuff like, things from Zara or Shopify or any of those things. And so the scope of this gets beyond data, services, and other agents and gets to, I think, the majority of commerce is going to be transacting over some kind of new rail. And it's going to be powered by agents going out and buying those things. And that's kind of the beginning of where we see this whole thing going, Ken.
Awesome. I mean, these are all great points and answers. I was basically, what I was after here was like in a payments kind of solution, you always have the cold start problem, right? Like the demand side and the supply side. These guys have to be interested in what they're buying and selling, right? And so it's really an easier lift to, at least to me, in my opinion, that focusing on a certain vertical, so that like you kind of really become the go-to solution in that vertical and then expand from there. Like that kind of seems like a natural evolution of a payment system. But I mean, I heard many cool ideas, but all of them were kind of diverse. I don't know what you guys are thinking here. Am I missing something, or yeah? I mean, just curious on how you think it's gonna unfold in your case.
Maybe I
Yeah.
can chime in here.
Right.
I have two specific views on this. One is I think the micropayments for data retrieval that Craig mentioned is going to be a massive market. One thing that AI agents need to do is RAG, retrieval augmented generation, so that their output is not solely based on the weights of their models, but they need to fetch live data to enrich the answers and responses they give to their customers. And in order to do that, they need to be able to query APIs. And in an agentic world, particularly for massive data providers are just simply not used to accepting micropayments to service specific slices of data. And if we as on-chain developers provide an easy solution for data providers to do that, that's an entirely new revenue stream for them. So they are incentivized to adopt this. And B, is the most sensible way of doing this, rather than having the data provider have to build out a whole API metering system, right? And then count, okay, how much does that correspond to? All of that would be handled automatically for them if they plug and play into this on-chain system. So I am massively, massively bullish on that. I think I'm so bullish on it that I'm like, maybe we shouldn't even talk about it publicly so that people don't catch on. But I'm super excited by that. There's another angle to this.
You did mention this like 40. What did you say earlier? That there was a technology.
402, yeah.
402.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I expand on this one, I thought that was interesting. What was it for at the time, and why it didn't pick up?
Yeah, so 402 it still remains in the HTTP spec, one of the response codes. You know, there are a bunch of them, right? Like 200 means okay. 404 we're all familiar with is not found. These are responses and error codes that APIs return to explain what happened. And 402 was one of these that was conceived of that was payment required. And so the idea was, hey, if you need to access a resource via an API, but you need to pay for it first, you would respond with 402. The problem was when this was conceived, there was no thought to like the actual implementation details of how this would be done. And so no one ever actually adopted it. And so now that you have publicly verifiable blockchains and you can say, you know, in your HTTP header, you can send information about, oh, I actually did make this payment. Here is a cryptographically signed proof of where I made the payment to, and that corresponds to how much it costs to query your API. We think the moment is nigh for companies to adopt that, and especially if we provide out-of-the-box solutions to help companies parse that data and transact. There are lots of things to figure out there from an engineering perspective, but like the building blocks are there. I want to highlight another aspect of this, which, you know, Don and Craig are coming at it from the startup founder perspective. They run their own companies that are focused on building out AI agents, which is obviously like the core of this discussion. Where I sit is in Coinbase developer platform. What we're focused on is providing the tools for these AI agents to transact on chain. And if you come at it from that angle, we think about what are the like AI agents that are most used today? Like forget crypto or anything. What are the AI agents that exist today? And I think the answer there is just chatbots, first of all. So ChatGPT, obviously. But more and more, I think we're all builders here. We're aware of these code generation agents, right? So you have Cursor, you have Versal v0, you have Replit agent. These are all agents that we work very closely with. And we think about, okay, these agents exist. There's a world in which, you know, I mean, Don talked a lot about like white collar job replacement. I'm a software engineer and I think about, well, when am I going to get replaced, right? But there's a world in which coding becomes so easy through these agents that anyone can become a builder. And we're really seeing this today, right? It's pretty easy to spin up a Next.js front end. So we think about it from the perspective of, given that premise, how can we make building on chain the easiest as possible for someone who is a builder, which in the future will be anybody. It can be a 5-year-old. And so this comes down to brass tacks of like, at the beginning, it's actually really tactical. It's like, AI agents need really well formatted documents specifying on-chain APIs so that when I ask, hey, ChatGPT, code up a web page that sends one Ether from this wallet to this wallet, and here's the private key, the chat agent can spit it out and spits out front end, and also calling all the backend APIs required to facilitate that transaction. And so we're focused at CDP on providing like these integrations and the documentation required so that these coding agents are very easily able to integrate our APIs. But this is going to evolve over time. So at first, it's just like really parsable documentation, right? Very simple, very vanilla. You could imagine then that evolving over to a fine-tuned model, right? Trained specifically on, let's say, Solidity, corpus of Solidity smart contracts, or a collection of apps built on top of the Coinbase developer platform. And then once you have that fine-tuned model, that can plug in directly into a variety of agentic tools like Cursor, and that will make coding on-chain apps even easier. And then as this evolves over time, right, like it just becomes less and less friction for builders to build on-chain apps, and so much so that one of the big value propositions, I think, for businesses to integrate on-chain is time to monetization, right? You can start, once you spin up a wallet, you can immediately start accepting USDC, right? There's no lead time to that. If you have a cryptographic key, you have an Ethereum address, you have a Bitcoin address, and you can start accepting funds. And our view is that it's actually like one part of this is the builder ecosystem. As more and more builders start using Replit agent and code generating agents, as we provide the documentation and the models and our own coding agents to enable builders to rapidly build on-chain apps by default, that's sort of one avenue by which the agents are going to come on-chain. It's basically because as builders build more apps through these agents, so much of that is going to be trained on a corpus of crypto because we've strategically made it so that like when builders spin up businesses, right, e-commerce websites, what have you, anything that requires monetization, the default libraries that the agents start using are on crypto. And then down the line, you can imagine on Coinbase developer platform, maybe it's like there's like a product that says, hey, spin up your own on-chain business. It's one click, you describe it, and then it just spins up the entire website for you.
Yeah, so you get to summarize, regardless of the use case, Coinbase wins. And also note Skyfire is on base as well. So
is Nevermind. No, I think what's interesting here is there's a lot of talk about like the one founder unicorn, right? And enable like what AI can enable. My take isn't that there's going to still be this limitation on who builds a unicorn. What I think is there will be less unicorns, but there will just be much more productivity across the board, right? And, you know, I think what we've already accounted for here is a lot of that transactional volume is going to be like low value, but high volume, right? And when you have existing payment systems that are gouging to use their rails, there is going to be a fundamental shift over to, I think, the cheaper option. So that is like an imperative from a business point of view to make this selection. I think on the data front, you know, an interesting, like we just launched a use case in the DePIN side of things, on the energy, in the energy space. So when we talk about verticalization, I think in this case, it's a DePIN that is working towards consolidating local energy markets. So in Europe, at least, you can sell back into the grid. If you've got solar panels or a wind turbine and you create electricity, you can push it back into the grid. So there's a combiner on there's a DePIN on Peak called Combiner, which is localizing these networks so that neighbors can buy the energy production from one another. So what are they doing right now? They're going out and they're aggregating all of this production and consumption. Sorry, I hit my mic. Production and consumption information. What we've enabled is with an LLM-based agent, we've strapped it to an HVAC system, an air conditioner, like that thing back there. And it's buying access to that API and the data feed, and then modeling out statistically when it believes there's going to be an overconsumption of data, and then signals to that air conditioner to turn on, right, to consume that excess. Like these are the types of initiatives that are going to emerge, I think, in relatively short order. What I'd like to point out is that, this is based on, I'm very opinionated on this. It's sort of like 20 years of consolidated knowledge. I don't think data marketplace is going to win. I don't think model marketplaces are going to win. You have to bring these two things together. And the most elegant form of bringing them together are AI agents, right? And enabling the system that's going to capture the value, the productivity of these agents, that's what's going to allow us to then potentially accommodate proper attribution and value transfer back up that supply chain. So when you start talking about large data aggregators that are going to be convinced to come into these systems, the first thing you have to have are productive agents that are going to be able to pay for these data sets. And so that's really, the distillation of the work that we've been doing over, in particular, the last 10 years, is a refinement to this state where we need to capture that discrete productive value of the last mile, which is this AI agent, and then have the ability from that productive value capture to potentially transfer that back upstream to all of the contributions and contributors to creating that end state inference or actionable insight or whatever you want to call it.
I appreciate that. Okay, I want to transition to my next question, and that is very briefly, like, what do you think the future shopping cart experience looks like? Like today, it's very much human centric, right? Like all the UI, the buttons, their color, their size, and everything, they're just designed for humans to actually like successfully purchase whatever item they have once they're there. If we're really thinking that the next billion customers are agents, what are the implications of that to the current shopping cart experience that we have? I'm curious what you all think on that front. Maybe we can start with Craig, then Don, then Yuga, then Don this time.
Yeah, so like the concept of a shopping cart, I think fundamentally changes. And where I see the world heading is you will have a personal agent or personal interface that knows your history, that knows your tastes, that is able to go out there and find SKUs that you would never even think of finding. So if you put yourself in the shoes of like a merchant today or somebody who has a large e-commerce business, I don't know, take like a Zara, for example, they have like 100,000 SKUs. Like even in my worst doom scrolling, I've never gone through 100,000 different SKUs. An agent can do that instantly. And so what these agents need is they need the ability of going out. They can search that today via the existing APIs, but then being able to make those payments or being able to make those purchases. And that's really a place where I want Skyfire to be able to play when the world is ready for that. And that is actually a B2B payment and not a consumer to business payment. I think because of the kind of penetration that they have today, that consumers are going to be using cards for a very long time. And I think it's consumer card to business. And you have this business that is able to actually go out and do this shopping, needs an API to do so. But that business to business transaction, I think, is where you have the need for a new rail. And that becomes kind of like a personalized shopper experience that today is only available for the hyper wealthy. That can be, turned into an app that digests your preferences and your history and then starts giving you really cool clothes. So in short, I see the level of drip in society going up dramatically as these agents are able to go out and actually shop for things like clothes or, new experiences that you might not even be able to find yourself.
Cool. Yuga, you want to add? Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate here, which is that I'm a little like I'm not convinced that in terms of like when we talk about shopping cart, right? What are we talking? We're talking about like the familiar experience of going to Amazon and you buy stuff and it's on the right hand side and you say, okay, this is the stuff I bought. While I agree that there will be some amount of agents replacing that experience, I don't view that as like the slam dunk case for a number of reasons. One is that people like to browse. It's fun, right? Like, I don't think we want to live in a world where we outsource every single decision to an agent. In fact, I won't. I simply won't, right? Like, this is the whole premise of Pinterest. Now, we can talk about the monetization model of Pinterest and whether that makes sense or not, but like, people like to browse and choose and be agents themselves. Or if I'm like going to the groceries, I like to pick my avocados. I don't want some robot to do that. I want to look at the avocado and say, is this ripe? You know, get a feel for it, etc. I got a very firsthand taste of this when I was working at Google, where I was for 8 years. Like, one of the teams I led was search personalization. And a lot of the data we saw is like, people like getting served content based on their history, for sure. But people also just like clicking around and choosing themselves, being agents in themselves. So like this case of, well, I do think, yes, there will be cases of in companies providing services like, oh, based on your personal history, reserve this restaurant for me, a Japanese restaurant for me, or pick out an outfit for me. Like, I'm sure that will exist. I am currently unconvinced that that's like the case that catches fire. I think, like Craig said, I think it's sort of like maybe it's more of a B2B case around things like data fetching and web scraping, and more like B2B SaaS models, I think, are going to get more translated from a microservice architecture to an agent-to-agent architecture. And that's where a lot of the like Don said, high volume, low value transactions are going to be paramount. But like the top of funnel, sort of humans browsing content, food, consumable goods, etc. I am personally skeptical that's going to be where the disruption is for on-chain agents. I think it's at a more infrastructural level where it'll be most impactful.
Yeah, I'm going to pass mic to Don, but before I do that, I think, yeah, I 100% agree with you, especially on the avocado point. It's really tricky, but yeah.
You got to touch it. You got to see how squishy it is. I agree with both points, or comments from both Craig and Yuga. I too am skeptical. I'm more skeptical though, Yuga, in the sense that, again, I think we're anthropomorphizing these things too much. It's novel and fun to think about having an assistant that's going to do stuff for me, but I don't think that's the real application for these agents. And, John, before you ask, like, these use cases are emergent. Agents are going to facilitate transactions on activities that haven't been imagined yet, right? So what does the shopping cart look like? I mean, I think it's a collection of APIs and or microservices that an agent is going to call upon from other agents, right? And then it's a question of what's the granularity of the service that's being provisioned by any given agent. I think, where do we see the future of things? Not looking in like the shorter midterm. I think in the longer term, this sort of peer-to-peer bartering system where it's just agents exchanging their services and assets directly with one another, perhaps without even the need for the proverbial shopping cart, right? It's just instantaneous access and negotiation. The shopping cart being there solely for the end state, right? What you negotiate and procure, as opposed to filling it up and then going to the checkout. So that's kind of where I would like to see things go. And this is the work that we're trying to do to drive the state to head in that direction.
I appreciate the answers, guys. All right. My final question is on the types of payments. So when we talk about payments in AI agents, I can think of 3 types, right? It could be a human, it could like a human individual or an enterprise paying an agent. It could be an agent paying a human, or it could be an agent paying to agent. Do you think it like this mental model is the right one? Do you think it's like meaningfully different in terms of like how you design your solution? And do you have a specific focus when it comes to like your go-to-market strategy on which of the 3 types you pay attention to and focus on? Let's do Don, Craig, Yuga, I guess.
So we're non-discriminating. Agents are agents to us, whether they're carbon-based or silicon-based. So we're trying to facilitate payments between those. Now, our motivation is a focus on silicon to silicon-based agents transacting, or agent to agent, as you described it. The reality is, pragmatically speaking, the only drivers at the moment right now are human or carbon-based to silicon-based, right? We really haven't seen a lot of silicon-based to silicon and agent to human. Well, we need to have the agents there that are doing this orchestration of whatever they're orchestrating with those, with the associated humans. So definitionally, I think it's a good way to categorize what we're talking about. In particular, because conceptually it's easy to grasp, right? There's not much fuzziness to the way that you describe it. From an organizational point of view, our real passion and motivation is around this new agentic ecosystem that's emerging and facilitating those transactions. I think where there is importance to what we're doing is in enabling the hooks for the carbon-based agents to actually hook into those emergent silicon to silicon-based systems, right? Because there is the potential that perhaps we get ostracized from this emergent system over the mid to long term. I think at best we're likely going to be able to ingratiate ourselves with this new economic activity, but I do think that like human GDP will pale in comparison to that of agents. The analogy I use in this, and it's a very crude one, so forgive me, but I kind of see this. It's like 1972, Richard Nixon just showed up in China and opened up this massive economic engine. And the reality is, over a 40-year period, try as we might, the West was never able to ingratiate ourselves in that economy, or infiltrate that economy. We were only able to ingratiate ourselves, and that's kind of the same dynamic that I see potentially emerging here. So enabling agent to agent transactions and also enabling the ingratiation of carbon-based or humans in that system as well.
Thank you. Passing on to Craig.
Yeah. So primarily what we're seeing today are agents that are paying for services or data. Like at least our mental model is really agent to API based payments, to where that API can deliver anything on the other side, which is why you see so many potential use cases in terms of this. It's like the core piece here is like payment is authentication, with this idea of like verified parties on both sides. So the places where we see right now are using your model, agent to API, I would say, which is really like agent to service or agent to, I guess you could say agent to agent in a couple cases. But that's primarily because like the agents today are really one-to-one with a developer or a business. And the future becomes one where agents begin spinning up themselves. And that's why the KYA becomes so important, to where it's not just a human on a one-to-one basis. You have a lot of complexity in terms of the verification there. I'd say the one place where I think there's another party to check out is Payman AI. They're really agent to human, which has its own complexities that go along with it, which is a little different from like payment as API, which is what we're focused on. But yeah, payment as API is really where our bread and butter is right now.
Craig, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, Don, what's up?
Um, in this case that you're describing, is the agent acting as a proxy for a human that's actually ultimately making the request, or is this like an agent that's completely discerning and has the logic to make the decision, independent of any human in the loop?
Yeah, it's graduating it's graduating to the latter, but
Yeah.
a lot of the agents that are being built today are just starting to scratch the surface of going beyond your standard like if then statements. I think what's cool about something like Skyfire is that the agents have like essentially a tool set that they can call on their own when they need to hit these services. And the developer doesn't have to go have a SaaS subscription to all these services in order to permission the agent to do that. We're seeing more and more agents, especially with the growth of these like orchestration protocols, becoming more and more autonomous and having access to our services versus, where we kind of started out feels a lot just like an application that has a little bit of non-deterministic function calling associated with it.
Yeah. I mean, the sense we have at the moment is it's emergent, but there's like this proxying of the human through the agent. So being pedantic about the definition, I would still define that as like human to agent. But I agree with you 100%. The space is moving super fast, and we're starting to see, productivity on the pure agent to agent side of things as well. Yeah.
Yeah. On that, maybe a different episode, we probably spent 2 hours on like, gents, define agent, go at it.
Yeah, that's a very hard one. I tried to answer that question myself and really struggled, but I actually gave up. Yuga, do you have any views on this that you'd like to share?
I think Craig and Don covered it for the most part. I'm glad Craig mentioned Payman as the agent to human case, because I think we work closely with them, and they're another company that's doing super interesting things. But yeah, I think from a purely numerical perspective, where we reach escape velocity is when agents are capable of incepting new agents autonomously, because then the growth becomes exponential and there is no limiting factor of a human pressing a button or configuring things. That's when things get really interesting. And when you live in a world with trillions of agents, then there are basically on the order of 1 trillion squared possible payment pairs, right? Or if it's any subset of the trillion, then it's actually 2 to the trillion number of subsets of 1 trillion agents that could be involved in a transaction, which far, far outnumbers the number of humans or businesses on this planet, which means just on a purely numerical basis, where things are going to get really dense and really interesting is the agent to agent case. And we can debate what that what agent to agent, but like machine to machines, silicon to silicon, however you want to define it. And so I think over the long term, that's where the real value is going to be captured, and where things get really interesting.
Amen,
Yeah,
brother.
I mean, it is very interesting to think about, because like if an agent spins up a new one, does it become responsible for its actions? Does that get baked into the reputation system and all that, and quickly you enter into sci-fi. So let's not just go that far, but it is definitely exciting future. I recalled I had one more discussion that I wanted to get your views on. So like currently AI agents are super cool, right? Don mentioned Truth Terminal. It's been like getting a lot of attention and hype with its unorthodox tweets, but I basically find myself like being really surprised by their capabilities most of the time, every now and then, at least. But they are certainly not reliable, right? Like they can totally make up stuff. They hallucinate. And then if the environment is adversarial, you can basically make an agent do anything that you want. You can jailbreak it. You could do like prompt injection attacks. So they're not really that robust against like adversarial kind of actors. So I mean, where we at reality check is that like there needs to be a human in the loop, right, supervising these agents. So do you think that's like do you have high confidence that's going to change, or like could there be a future where, you know, like agents automate like 98% of the way, and then last bit you're going to always need a human? Because if that's the latter case, I mean, it really shrinks the capabilities and of all the like cool things that we're imagining here. If we're going to need like humans to actually like you know, confirm a payment at the last mile, right? So does that worry you at all, or do you, like you're just highly confident that that's not going to be like that's going to change in the future? Yuga, maybe we can start with you this time, and then I'll hand it over to Don and Craig.
Yeah. Well, I think we're fortunate because another super adversarial space is crypto. So we are not strangers to this problem. Exploits on smart contracts happen all the time. People are constantly trying to find people's private keys and gain control of wallets. And so, especially at a company like Coinbase, where security and reputation are pretty much the most important part of our brand, we think about this constantly. And so the fact that they are agents doesn't necessarily change that aspect of it. And so a lot of the controls that you have for crypto wallets and custody and fund management in general are going to apply to agents equally. So these are going to be things like multi-sig wallets, where maybe it's an MFN where some of them are humans and some of them are robots. It's things like multi-party computation, where the private key is sharded across multiple parties and it requires a consensus or a threshold of the parties in order to facilitate a transaction. This is going to be things like a policy engine, where transactions under a certain threshold may be automated, but transactions above a certain threshold require, again, explicit approval of a human. This is going to be things like WebAssy, which do anomalous transaction detection and alert a human or policyholder when something weird happens. I don't view these problems as fundamentally different from the fact that people and nation states and hackers and other bad faith actors are trying to gain access to funds every day. And that doesn't change based on the fact that whether it's a robot or a human. Now, you know, once you get to, okay, quantum computing happens and ECDSA is broken or something, then that's another 2-hour conversation, right? But let's assume that doesn't happen. I feel like crypto is a very security-minded industry, and the security principles apply just as much to humans as it does to AI agents.
Thank you. Don, you want to give us your take?
Sure. I think as we make this transition over the midterm, yeah, humans will remain in the loop. I've heard this question a few times recently. I find it somewhat perplexing. So I think 100% agents are going to replace the lowest common denominator in these systems. The weakest link is oftentimes, at least in an enterprise setting, the human actor. You know, okay, an agent can hallucinate, but so can a human. And so we've spent 40 or 50 years building out business process optimization architectures and technologies, and over the last 25 to 35 years, robotic process automation, which are designed to constrain the human in the loop. And oftentimes the human is left in the loop because it is the cheapest mechanism for performing that given activity, right? So, you know, an example historically would be having a human in a call center that's receiving calls, taking in the oral requests. I think it's becoming demonstrable that that service can be displaced by a lower cost agent on the AI front. And so this scenario where you're pointing out that 98% of service activity, et cetera, is automated and involves AI agents and lacks humans in the loop, I think is a likely scenario. Does it concern me? No. We are incredibly adaptable as a species. I think, a part of me, there's a significant part of me that believes that this technology is going to help unshackle ourselves from, the mundane aspects of life and allow our creativity to flourish. So, that is sort of an underlying motivation for this. Let's unshackle our imagination and let's really extend the boundaries of what's possible. So I think it's exciting in a lot of respects.
I think what you're outlining is a timing issue. I would not bet against this technology becoming smarter than humans very quickly. Like, I absolutely not. I mean, like, we're already seeing these industries like call centers that are much better, even with like hallucinations, are much better than actual humans taking those calls. Like, would I be comfortable with an agent doing brain surgery on me today? No. But in the future, like, will it have a better success rate than humans? Probably. I mean, like, already your physician, you're probably going to get a better hit rate with an agent or like an LLM powered like interface than you will with this cottage industry of doctors right now. And so, I think if LLM development or the models themselves stop today, you're still going to have 6 months to a year worth of app developers catching up to the existing capabilities. The speed at which this is growing, I don't think you're going to have a 98% success rate. I think you're going to have a success rate that is way better than humans, to the fact where when you have humans actually still in the processes, you're probably going to have an LLM or some kind of AI powered agent checking the decision of the human.
Yeah, that's where payment comes in.
Damn, that's a good answer. All right, guys, that was it on my end. I think this was a really, really fun discussion. I've actually genuinely learned a lot. So yeah, thank you all for joining. And then for listeners, thanks for listening.
Thanks for having us.